When you're talking about breath work in yoga, which have the classic name of Prāṇāyāma, or the extension of prana, if you see the way it's spoken in the text and the way it's spoken in tradition also, like the classic teachers, has always been with a certain focus on exhalation. There's a level of importance that is given to the exhalation, level of priority that is given to the exhalation. In tradition, you see in certain texts that they talk about ratios as objectives for the breath. So ideal ratios. Ratio means the comparison between the duration of inhalation, exhalation, the holdings of the breath. The classic ratio that is spoken of is 1 for inhalation, 4 for retention of the breath in, 2 for exhalations, and then 0 or 1 for holding of the breath out. The Prāṇāyāma tradition, which I'm part of, for example, would emphasize the holding of the breath out, but certain other traditions do not emphasize that. So they leave it, the holding of the breath out of the picture. That ratio would mean something like, if you're inhaling 5 seconds, for example, you would then hold for 20 seconds, holding the breath in. You would then exhale for 10 seconds, and either you just don't hold the breath out or you hold the breath out for 5 seconds. If you're doing like a more proper pranayama, let's say you'd be inhaling 20, you'll be holding the breath in for 80 seconds, you will be exhaling 40 seconds, and then holding the breath out for 20 seconds. A main point on this ratio, or this classic ratio that I'm explaining, is that there's a lot of emphasis on the part that you're not breathing, in. So the inhalation is just ratio 1, it's just 1 count, let's say. Well, everything else, the holding of the breath in, the exhaling, the holding of the breath out, happens without extra air, without extra oxygen. So you see, just by the way they spoke of classic ratios, there's a lot of emphasis on not breathing. And this makes sense on my perspective, that the training of yoga breath or pranayama is actually to be able to tolerate more and more the capacity of not breathing. So it's very different than that what you see sometimes in classes where the teachers will talk about the importance of oxygen, breathe more oxygen, as if that's the goal, to be able to breathe more. When in fact, if you go further into your studies on that, you see that the goal is to be able to breathe less. We can relate this intention of the traditional yogis of breathing less, or extending the exhalation, or extending the holdings of breath, while diminishing the importance of the inhalation. You can translate that in terms of modern science. There is a function, let's say, or a happening on the breath, which is called the Bohr effect, and that is when you start to breathe less. So when you have less oxygen in your circulation, or available in your circulation, and you start to have more carbon dioxide, so CO2 accumulation in your system, you start to have this Bohr effect. What the accumulation of CO2 causes to the system is, first, it stimulates circulation. The CO2 makes the capillaries, or the small blood vessels of your body, to dilate, to open. So circulation is increased, especially in the extremities of the body, such as the brain, the hands, the feet. So that's number 1. There's a stimulation or increase of circulation. Number 2 is that when you have this accumulation of CO2 in your system, there is a modulation of your nervous system towards relaxation. The heartbeat to reduce, the pressure reduce, that you can even do as an experiment. If you place your fingers on your wrist or on the neck, where you can check your heartbeat. In general, if you're like a healthy individual, when you inhale, there will be an increase of heartbeat. When you exhale, like a slow exhalation, in general, depending on how you do it, if it's not forced, there will be a decrease of the heartbeat, a calming of the nervous system. That's an example to explain this effect of accumulation of CO2 and relaxation. Is, if you remember in the old days on the planes, when someone is having like a panic attack, what was the idea? So you're in the plane and you're having a panic attack, you're afraid of flying. Then the staff would give you a paper bag to breathe in. What is it that is happening when you breathe inside a paper bag? Is, as you keep breathing that air, it starts to accumulate CO2 inside. The CO2 is not leaving, and there's no fresh oxygen entering because you're breathing inside the bag. The accumulation of CO2 in that bag and breathing of that CO2 promotes relaxation of the nervous system. So through pranayama, through yogic breathing, that's also what you're trying to do, is to have a general calming of the nervous system, or we could call a parasympathetic activation. Another effect of this Bohr capacity is that when there's too much oxygen in the circulation, the hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen molecules to your cells, actually they don't release the oxygen, they hold onto it. While when you have a lot of CO2 accumulation, the hemoglobin will deliver the oxygen more readily, more freely to the cells. So you actually have this aspect of promoting more energy to your body, although you're not exactly breathing. Another point to consider is if you look into people that train the breath, they will always be training CO2 tolerance. So the tolerance of your system to deal with accumulation of carbon dioxide. Training of the breath for, let's say, divers or whoever works with the necessity of doing long breaths, working with a lot of respiratory capacity, they're always working for this tolerance to be able to extend their breath, not to breathe more. Doing a long breath, doing a strong breath is very easy. Anyone can do that. But holding the breath for a minute, that's a different ball game. A goal on your training, your yogic breathing training, could be to eventually be able to do breaths longer than a minute. So for example, you could do several combinations, inhaling 20, exhaling 40, inhaling 40, exhaling 20, inhaling 10, holding for 40, exhaling 10, and so on. That mark of 1 minute normally shows that there's a lot of CO2 tolerance. You're starting to develop your capacity of your body, of your nervous system, to be able to withstand it. And if you do this systematically, it has to be done slowly, it has to be done over the years, in a very systematic fashion, with a lot of patience and care. But eventually you start to have those effects that I mentioned before, especially the nervous system effects of calming. They will be increased, they will be extended. And then we finally have the idea of the classic yogic tradition that pranayama, or these breathing exercises, lead towards meditation. There are different ways of understanding that. Even, I'm not talking too much about prana here, the ideas of prana, but just in a more, let's say, more modern scientific way, what those capacities of breath holds to generate is an extreme modulation of the nervous system towards relaxation, which then of course creates the proper environment, the mental environment for meditation. So my suggestion is, when you're doing your yoga practice, when you're doing your pranayama, stop with the obsession of oxygen. Oxygen is not the most important thing of breathing. Oxygen will come to you, don't worry. The most important is your tolerance to not being able to breathe and being calm with that tolerance. And when you think about deep breaths, next time someone tells you take a deep breath, don't think about strong inhalation. Think of a long exhalation. Think of maybe holding the breath out or holding the breath in.